This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Sarah Fay, and we discuss her new book, Pathological. This was an eye-opener for me, and I'm sure you're going to hear it in my voice. But to hear Sarah break apart the DSM, which is the Bible for psychiatric conditions, and in her case, she has been diagnosed 6 times in her life incorrectly. And there's a whole process for how this can happen. And the process for how it can happen, the foundation for how it can happen, trust me, this is frightening. Her story is frightening. But ultimately, the bigger picture lesson is the lack of the use of the scientific method. All of these psychiatric conditions and no science. An amazingly sad time for the modern world that we've been taken over by this system. Sarah does a great job of bringing forward this tale and explaining. And I hope you enjoy this very important conversation with Sarah Fay. I'm imagining one of those situations you might see on a college campus. Somebody sitting at one of those almost homemade lemonade stands, and there's a cardboard sign in front of him or her, and it says something to the effect of, the DSM is the worst thing to ever happen to America. Prove me wrong. Sounds a little controversial. A lot of people don't even know what the DSM is. I've heard of it, but I forgot about it till I saw your work. I'm going to let you define it. But am I completely out of bounds to think that the weight, the way it's used, what it comprises, that it really can, if somebody wants to take an objective vantage from their vantage, they really could ascribe all kinds of negative aspects to it, could they not?
Absolutely. Let me explain what the DSM is for anybody who doesn't know. If anyone doesn't know, they're with me. I was on my 6th diagnosis and in my 40s before I even had heard of it.
We'd better take a step back. 6th diagnoses of what?
I was diagnosed with 6 different mental disorders, and that's what's in the DSM. Essentially, the DSM is a book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it's the book from which all of our mental health diagnoses come. Meaning depression, anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. Those are listed in the DSM. Underneath them are lists of symptoms. You qualify for said diagnosis based on the number of symptoms you present with to a clinician. That's basically how it works. What I didn't know was that none of the diagnoses, with the exception of dementia and rare chromosomal disorders, are scientifically valid. Largely, they're unreliable as well. Scientifically valid means they can be shown to exist outside of self-reported symptoms and a clinician's opinion. There's no blood test, no x-ray that we can take that says, yes, you have major depressive disorder. See, I can show you right here. This is your white blood cell count or whatever it would be if we were going to make comparisons to physical illnesses. We can't do that with DSM disorders.
It sounds like a religious text in a way.
Well, it's called psychiatry's Bible often. A lot of people dismiss that and don't like that term. What it used to mean is that people follow it to the letter. But I think what you're saying, and that's absolutely right, is that it's essentially hypothetical. It gets worse in some ways because then what I did was once I had been diagnosed with anorexia, generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, ADHD, and then finally bipolar disorder, I was on my 6th diagnosis and I still wasn't feeling better.
Let me stop you there. Let's really stay at the big picture for a second, because you just laid out a can of worms.
I know.
You just laid out a scenario where, okay, most mental disorders are not objective things. They can be interpreted, it's subjective. From that diagnosis, some people can be committed, some people can be, forced to take some medicine or voluntarily take some medicine, get essentially addicted to some medicine. These can be very strong types of drugs for the mind. And I started digging through your world and I'm like, how is this not the opening conversation for modern America?
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. It shouldn't be interpreted as controversial, but I think it's an opening question that's very important. I'm a man. This is something different for men and women. I believe the demographics by the numbers will say that. Is that not correct? That you will see more women coming into these diagnoses and taking more of these drugs than men. Is that a fair assessment? And can you put some data to that to flesh it out even more?
We're the largest consumers of mental health care. We're more likely to be prescribed antidepressants and treated with electroshock therapy and hospitalized. We're more than twice as likely as men to receive mental health services, so meaning a DSM diagnosis, a mental health diagnosis. We tend to be diagnosed with what's considered, quote unquote, neurotic disorders in the negative sense of the term. So depression, anxiety, PTSD. Yeah, we're the ones in many ways. I mean, there are other at-risk groups as well, but we're the largest consumers. We're the ones who are in there the most. I've always wondered if that had a lot to do with my own situation.
Let me keep expanding things out a little bit here. So right now in America, and I get to sit there and look at America from 8,000 miles away, America's having all kinds of cultural debates right now. I think also a lot of these debates are breaking down between men and women. I don't think the average American male is preoccupied with, look, I have a sister roughly my age, Gen X, with 3 kids. She says she's not interested, but she knows everything there is to know about the identity wars in America right now, the gender wars in America right now. And as I was going through your world, I was thinking, wow, I'm not saying these are mental disorders. I guess they could be. I don't know. Right now, New York City recognizes 31 genders. I don't think the average American male recognizes 31 genders, but I do think that more women in America would be open to the conversation. So I guess what I'm driving at here is it seems like there's this divide that when I was looking at, being reminded of what the DSM is, and I'm thinking, well, this is definitely breaking down between men and women. And I'm thinking about all these other cultural issues. This is where the miscommunication is happening. It's in this world right here that we're talking about.
Rather than gender, I see it actually as a divide between adults and children and adolescents. Because children and adolescents, if you want to see a frenzy that's going on, and that might be the wrong word to use, it's really this idea that over the course of the pandemic, the mental health of adolescents and children, adolescents in particular, has gotten so much worse. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday that was reporting on this. And it was actually the first article I've read that was fairly responsible in its reporting, in that it asked, is this real? Is this really happening? Or are we overdiagnosing? I'll give you an example. The DSM, a diagnosis doesn't take context into account. Clinician will just see you. You will present, is the word that they use, as someone with major depressive disorder, or we'll say anxiety disorder, because those are the 2 most common diagnoses. And that's the most that we can do. And that's the most that we can give someone. What about what's happening in your life? Did you just lose your job? Are you having a difficult time in school? Well, we have a group of adolescents that went through a global pandemic and spent 2 years in their rooms.
Wait till they wake up and they realize that never should have happened.
That is another issue. That's a very understandable response to a global pandemic and the situation they saw themselves in. Instead of sitting down with them and saying, yes, you're absolutely right. You have every reason to feel this way. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about your feelings and your thoughts and your behaviors now and the effect it's having. We're giving them a diagnosis. And that's the real issue, I think. And they don't have agency the way adults do.
The other issue that starts to immediately pop up is my opening salvo for the divide. Is this also another divide? Meaning, is the typical teen female versus the typical teen male in the context of the pandemic having the same reaction. I mean, for example, you and I know this is a dicey topic for a white male to open his mouth and say anything. I mean, that's what I am. I do this podcast. I try to be fair. I was just back in the States for the first time in 2.5 years. I was there for most of November, December, the first week of January. I'm driving around in the States near suburban DC. 50% of women that I'm seeing driving in a car alone, wearing a mask. I don't think the average American male would be doing that. When you bring up the issue of what's going on with the young people in the pandemic, I'm back to this divide versus grouping everybody into the same group, that there's different groups. Look, I know this did not affect my 17-year-old nephew in any way, shape, or form, other than it being an annoyance that he had to go through the process of wearing a mask. I know it didn't affect him. He liked to play football, and that was it. That's not going to be the same for some other people. I'm sure there were some young American males that it bothered them, but I'm going to guess, like the setup to your work here and me asking the question about the divide between male and female, I'm going to guess that younger females suffered a lot more from the pandemic shutdown.
I haven't seen data on that. What I have seen is that among people of color, mental health diagnoses and then also suicide rates have gone way up. That I've seen. I haven't seen any data on gender necessarily.
Yeah, that's an interesting one too. It's because right back when you're saying the rates of diagnosis have gone up, gets us back to the whole big picture of your world, this insight you're giving us, which is the diagnosis may or may not have even been valid. It might have just been somebody that was having a hard time, but they didn't deserve that diagnosis. They didn't deserve to fall into the psychiatric industrial complex.
What I worry about, and this is what happened to me, is that when you're given a diagnosis very young, I received my first one at 12, you're prone to see life through a lens of diagnosis. My parents were divorcing. I was going to a new high school, very typical situation for an adolescent. And I was terrified and I was sad and I had a stomach ache. I didn't want to eat. I was told I had anorexia, but I had none of the characteristic features at the time. So I wasn't weighing myself. I wasn't obsessed with my body image. I didn't think I was fat. Yet I started to connect my feelings, thoughts, and behaviors to a diagnosis. Then I started to see life that way. And that's what I worry about when you're formulating your identity, as we are in high school and that age, then you start to see yourself as a diagnosis. It doesn't help that we say you are an anorexic, not you have anorexia or you are bipolar.
I don't know if I'm being devil's advocate or just sharing the counter perspective. I'm a male. I did not experience these conversations. I did not experience growing up with people that shared these things. I think most of the people that I grew up with on the male side, just typical guys. And I guess somebody got cut from the sports team or somebody didn't get the girl or whatever. I'm sure there was ups and downs and sadness and everything. And maybe behind the scenes, somebody had a mom, my son's not doing well, and went out and got a diagnosis. Maybe something happened there. It's a divide. It's a real divide.
Well, I do, but I don't buy the divide because I didn't have that experience either. No one talked about diagnoses. This was the 1980s. And I didn't even know what anorexia was when I got it. It was not at all like today and what's happening and the way that it's part of the public discourse. People may not have heard of the DSM, but you've heard of the DSM because we use these terms all the time. We're diagnosing each other. We're diagnosing ourselves. But that didn't happen when I was growing up either. Everything was in the shadows. No one knew what I had. And even in my 20s, so 1990s, early 2000s, in my world, people didn't talk about these things. Certainly not the way that we do now. We didn't have social media. That's part of it.
You mentioned the change in terms of, I'm guessing today, the percentage of young women that are diagnosed with anorexia is dramatically higher than back in the day. How are these diagnoses changed over the decades? Have doctors become much more apt to give that diagnosis or any diagnosis of any particular mental disorder? I mean, I'm assuming so because huge numbers of people in America are gacked up on all these antidepressants.
Well, 46% of American adults, and 20% of American children and adolescents will receive a DSM diagnosis in their lifetime. That's half the country.
My first reaction is, That's crazy.
No pun intended, yes.
Am I crazy to say that's crazy?
When you think about it, it begs the question, how can that be? I walk by playgrounds and I think 1 in 5 of these kids are being told they have a mental illness. And they're 5 years old. They're 2 years old. We're allowed to diagnose the 2-year-old with bipolar disorder.
Whoa. Now I got to step back. Hold on. My opening salvo was sitting at the college student union or whatever, proved to me wrong that the DSM is, in my mind, I wanted to say is not evil. Okay, 2-year-old bipolar, I'm back to evil now.
I mean, it's why I attack the book and not psychiatry. And I know that's a strange distinction to make, meaning I attack the book of the DSM because it really is this, and now I'm going to get you even more riled up. It's such a flawed manual because none of it is scientific. Yet the other aspect of this is we think it is. That's a problem. The American public thinks it is. Psychiatry knows it isn't. That's a place where I'm really concerned, which is the gap between what psychiatry knows.
Why are you drawing this line between the book and the practitioners? You just invalidated it with what you said right there.
Say more.
You just said practitioners know that it's not valid, but they still use it and make money off it, and that's how they're making their living. How do we separate the two? I don't want to use the pejorative evil, but okay, if there's an evil book, a whole army of people utilize this evil book to diagnose 2-year-olds and say they have bipolar and possibly have them on medication at 2 years of age. I can't separate the individual that's using the book to get this diagnosis and then going ahead and prescribing the medicine. I can't do that in my mind.
I respect that. I do understand what you're saying, but as someone who I'm on medication, I continue to be, I don't accept a diagnosis anymore because I identified with it too strongly. But if we want to stay at that more global or higher view or more general view, that's absolutely valid. The problem is that the DSM has been with us since 1952. It's the diagnostic system we have. In many ways, it's intractable the way the Bible is. It's what we've got. That is, in some ways, it's a necessary evil, if we want to call it that. We can't throw it out the window. And I've spoken with DSM scholars and other psychiatrists and researchers, and that would be, of course, mayhem because then people couldn't get services. What's interesting, though, is that initially diagnoses were used.
But hold on one sec. The services could be essentially scams on some fronts. If this is a book that's not scientific, theoretical, in some ways philosophy, and we're giving diagnoses that then allow people to go on antidepressants, major medicine, that just strikes me as like, that's what the services are. It's frightening. The whole thing's frightening.
I know. That's why I wrote the book.
I would advise any young person, this is what I would say, right? Never tell anybody you're dealing with somebody. Find out a way to get around it without talking to professionals. Because the moment you're in the quote system and you're defined, they've put you on some medicine, who knows what's going to happen for the rest of your life?
Well, there's a middle ground there, which is, can we as adults finally talk about this? Can we as adults actually tell each other and have this conversation that DSM diagnoses and the mental health diagnoses we receive aren't scientifically valid and rarely reliable, instead of the media especially perpetuating the myth that they are? I see other people as being responsible. And then once that happens, again, those diagnoses are what we have to use right now. And they are useful to some degree in getting people some sort of care.
To some degree, to get some sort of care. That's as subjective sounding as what you don't like is subjective about the DSM.
Well, it's funny. I feel like I'm defending the DSM now, and I have absolutely.
You're dealing with Mr. Skeptic over here, right?
Exactly. You're more skeptical than I am, and I'm really skeptical.
I'm hardcore, but I was very happy to see in your prologue, your first couple pages of laying it out, if somebody is not thinking about this, if somebody is not familiar with the DSM, you read the first few pages and you're like, it's a punch to the solar plexus. It's like, wow, this is the life that we're all living. This is this secret society that's governing, quote, mental health. It is, again, I'm going to say it again, it's frightening.
Yes, I agree. What worries me is there are people who need care.
Of course.
Unfortunately, most of them who need the most care. I mean, there's a difference between serious mental illness and any mental illness. Serious mental illness tends to be, if we're going to use the diagnostic terms, or if not, psychosis, suicidality, if we want to be that general and not use the diagnoses. And those people end up in prisons and jails or homeless on the street. I worry about not getting them care.
Let's keep it at that moment for a second, because this is an interesting point. Essentially, it's the bell curve point. On whatever the issue is, there's always going to be an outlier or outliers. I find it fascinating that America has gone from let's help the people on the edges of the bell curve that are in an abnormal situation or have an abnormal condition. Let's help them. Versus now we've gone through the situation where it's like we take the edge of the bell curve in America and we extrapolate out and we tell everybody that doesn't have or is not in that position that you must ponder and think about this nonstop, whatever the issue is. I wonder how much that is possibly affecting people. And listen, to go off on a side tangent here, I have seen the stated rates of, let's say, people that are LGBTQ or whatnot. That's changed dramatically from when I was a teenager. I've seen numbers for the young people today. I've seen it news reporting of 20, 30%. I'm like, okay, that's only possible because we're telling everybody it's an option. To me, this all feeds into the mental condition of current modern America. Am I completely crazy too? They need to put me on medicine as well? Am I out there? I mean...
Well, I don't want to, again.
You don't want to diagnose?
No, I don't want to diagnose you. I'm not a mental health professional.
I might not be phrasing this correctly, but I think you see kind of what I'm driving at.
In the push to, quote unquote, destigmatize mental illness, what we've actually done is given everyone a disorder instead of accepting those with serious mental illness.
Bingo.
There is a statistic that some diagnoses are more accepted now, so depression, anxiety, ADHD, whereas others are not. The haves and the have-not, schizophrenia, substance abuse disorder, the stigmatization of those has gone way up. That's fascinating. As you say, we've expanded disorder instead of allowing normal, if we want to call it that, or average or typical, whatever we want to call it, healthy, to be the majority. Because we've done that, those with serious mental illness are still not getting care. And that's problematic.
Let me read something. This is from your prologue. This is just a little brief excerpt. I want to set the stage here. You were at a facility. After I told her about the darkness and racing thoughts and suicidality, she shifted in her chair and looked at me. Her eyes were tired, exhausted. This is after your 6th diagnosis. She said she could admit me to be examined by a psychiatrist. You said, and then what? She sighed. You might be transferred to the psychiatric ward here or at another hospital. She paused. But you don't want that. And seeing your world, seeing your work, if I ever fell into a place where something went terribly wrong and I actually legitimately was in the headspace of a serious mental disorder, if I could still make decisions, I would scream and yell to never get involved in being in the system because of what I just read from you.
I hadn't read it. That was the problem. That actually occurred in an emergency room, and that was a nurse. It was not a mental health professional warning me about this. Later, I ended up back in that same emergency room and suicidal. They call us SIs, meaning suicidal ideation. That's how we were referred to in the emergency room. It wasn't just me. I was there with other people. It was the same thing. I mean, we waited, I think, 6 hours to see anyone. Again, there was no assurance that we would end up in a psychiatric facility because there's a lack of beds. There just isn't room for people. We don't have, again, services for people to offer them.
Let me ask you, what were your influences? And what I mean by that, sometimes I can look at the 1980s and 1990s being an adult, my 20s, 30s, whatnot, and I can look at something like the Oprah show. This is not something that men necessarily cared about, but Oprah made the conversation of everything normal. From my perspective, from a male perspective, it just looked like to me, women were sharing everything about everything, every situation they could imagine. And I thought to myself, well, is that good or bad? Because then it takes potentially somebody who is, relatively speaking, normal, and then they start to think and understand about issues and concepts that maybe they get influenced by. Can I ask you, what was your influence growing up? Was it getting into the system one time on anorexia that then things started to snowball. But what was influencing you? Because you made these choices to accept these diagnoses. What was influencing you culturally that this was something that could potentially be good for you?
I stress in the prologue that I'm not a victim. Some people see themselves as psychiatric survivors. I don't see myself as that at all. I made those decisions. I was a participant and a willing one. When I was young, that was different. As you say, I was a book nerd. I didn't watch Oprah, so that wasn't my experience in that way. I did read about depression for the first time in William Styron's memoir.
What were you studying in college?
I actually studied English and women's studies, just to get you riled up some more.
Well, okay, but when you say you study women's studies, okay, that's not necessarily riling me up, but obviously it's a little bit different than studying math or engineering.
Well, at the time, it was essentially, this was at University of Michigan. You took classes in other departments, philosophy, English, that had some angle on gender. It wasn't quite what it is today.
How do you perceive today, by the way? I do know that when I read broad accounts of the college experience today, it appears to be that most college campuses are majority female, that there's less and less men attending college. I would think what I've observed culturally in the last 5 or 6 years, I suspect young women are taking on a much different understanding of all of these cultural issues, especially something like the great gender debates of right now, than you would have at your generation. I mean, it seems like it's changed dramatically.
I teach at a university. I'm on the front lines, so to speak, and I see this and my colleagues see this, and there's no question. We have students coming to us with a laundry list of diagnoses, 2, 3, 4 diagnoses at once. So there's no question that this is happening. One of my colleagues really sees it in her female students. I haven't made that distinction yet, but she does say that. And that's just one person's experience. I haven't seen any data on that.
Well, you know, once they get out of school and they are in the system, so to speak, I mean, we've already spoken that women would be twice as likely to get a mental health diagnosis. I don't necessarily even know where I'm going with this. I just know it's a problem. I know it's a huge problem. And I can look at the divide between men and women in America. I can look at it from a political level where you can see in voting patterns, men and women are voting very differently. It seems like if I try to imagine myself being a female right now and I'm learning all of this, and maybe they're more interested in a lot of these issues than guys might be. Guys are like, hey, let's go get drunk and hang out. I'm not saying women don't do that, but okay, let's just joke on guys for a second. But if women are more apt to take in all this information and consider all this information, more empathetic, and guys are a little more like the old Michael Jordan Nike commercial, hey, just do it. It seems like there's a real rub and a real conflict that is maybe at the root of everything that's happening in America right now.
Well, I think those are really huge stereotypes about both men and women. I'm not sure that I fell into that stereotype. I'm not sure I am more empathic than anyone. Serious mental illness, you aren't making good decisions necessarily when you're in that state. Certainly not when you're in an acute phase or in crisis. And that's very real. That suffering is very real in young people, in adults. I see what you're saying, but I'm not sure we can reduce it to that necessarily.
But as you point out, though, that there's also the distinction, as you just mentioned, serious mental illness. Okay. But then there's also, as your work points out, we just don't know. In some instances, it might just be someone's gone through a typical life trauma and they're sad, and give them a month or two and they're going to be okay. That's the rub for me.
One thing I recommend, I started a public awareness campaign called Pathological, the movement. And what I want, or I hope people will ask their doctors, which I wish I had asked my doctor when handed a diagnosis, is this situational? Could this be situational? Could this be the result of what I'm going through or my history? And then the second question is this episodic? Meaning, no mental illness has been proven to be chronic, yet we believe that they are, and we're often told that they are. So if this is episodic, would this pass in time? Could I give this 2 weeks and come back? Could we touch base in a month, whatever it might be? And then the third question is, whatever those answers give us, what does that mean for my treatment? And if someone does recommend medication, you should get an exit strategy. Medications shouldn't be assumed to be lifelong. I wasn't given this exit strategy, and I wish I had been. Antidepressants were only tested for 3 months. They were meant to be short-term Band-Aids for what you were going through, and then you would ease off them. You would titrate off. Exit strategy would say, okay, we're going to try these for 3 months. We're going to check in and we're going to see how you're doing. But people are being told that their diagnoses are chronic. I was told that all of my diagnoses were chronic. That is where I see the problem. And if we could ask those questions, one problem is that we hold doctors up to a standard. We're often afraid to question our doctors. I certainly would have been. But if we can ask ourselves those questions, that might be a start.
As the son of a doctor, I've never been afraid of questioning them. Kind of like, okay, you guys are up for a challenge here.
Just to go to your point, I just want to say one thing, which is, I think, also maybe a little bit startling to people and maybe to you. When I say I don't want to attack psychiatry, 5 of my 6 diagnoses came from primary care physicians. Most of the diagnosing is coming from primary care physicians. They write 80% of antidepressant prescriptions.
They're all guilty. They're all guilty.
This is coming from people who are not trained. Basically, only 24% of medical schools offer training to primary care physicians that's longer than 12 hours. Right there is one place where we could start to look at, okay, this is a problem in terms of both diagnosis, prescribing, and what can we do to change that?
How many different medications have you taken in the quote psych space, the big pharma psych space?
I didn't count. I've never counted. I think that's something that tends to happen among quote unquote psychiatric survivors. I was on and off many at that point when I was in crisis and told that I had bipolar disorder. The other thing is I came to medication very late. It was not something I took easily. I was the kind of person who wouldn't take aspirin. My situation is a little bit different. I didn't take my first psychotropic medication until I was in my 30s. That's very rare. But once I took a medication, I was quickly put on other medications, taken off medications, put on combinations or cocktails of medications. So I understand that once you do that, it's very easy to get in that cycle of, let's try this dosage, let's try that dosage. And you're messing with your brain chemistry and you're trying to stabilize your brain chemistry, but you're constantly changing the dosage or type of medication that you're on.
I'm going to use that word frightening again. I give you credit for, it sounds like you might not even necessarily know, or you'd have to go do a lot of digging to figure it out, but you sound very lucid for having taken all of these things, which scared the bejesus out of me. Let me lay something out, just kind of a little side tangent here. I'm thinking of a first grade classroom, bunch of little kids, and they're sitting at their desks. Most of those little girls sitting at those desks, they're going to be sweet. They're not going to be wild. They're not going to be crazy. A lot of those little boys are going to be bouncing. And I know that something that's happened over the decades is that, I don't know if it started with the teachers making recommendations or whatnot, but a lot of these young boys have been put on assorted ADHD medicines to calm them down. I wonder, and I don't know if you've seen any data about this, I wonder, is the diagnosis, is the acceptance of these diagnoses for a young boy to have ADHD, is that driven in some way by the parental experience? Meaning, if the mother has had a chance to be connected to the mental health system in some way, that she's more likely to accept that her son needs to be on big pharma versus perhaps a mother who had no experience with that?
That I don't know. I don't know a lot of people who are happy and satisfied with their experience in the mental health systems. In fact, I have not met a single person who hasn't said to me, yes, I understand. Yes, I've tasted this. Yes, I know someone who's been through something like this, or had children who've gotten one diagnosis after another. What I will say about ADHD is one of 3 false epidemics. And these are fascinating. So what happens is the DSM goes through various revisions. We've been through 7 at this point. When it's revised, what's happened is criteria has often been loosened for diagnosis. ADHD is a really clear example. It used to be called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You may notice some people call it ADD, attention deficit disorder. Well, why is that? Well, between the DSM-3, so the 3rd edition and the 4th edition, they dropped the H and basically made it optional. All of a sudden, ADHD, the cornerstone of this diagnosis, which was hyperactivity, you didn't need it anymore. And they did that so that they could diagnose girls, going to your point. Suddenly, you did not have to be hyperactive. And this whole new swath of potential, both consumers and patients and children, could get the ADD or ADHD, we tend to use the terms interchangeably, diagnosis. Now, what happens is the media, instead of looking at, oh, yes, the DSM changed the criteria, obviously, that's why more children are being diagnosed. They report on an ADHD epidemic and essentially convince both parents, teachers, and doctors that, oh, this is this very undiscovered and dangerous diagnosis, and children have to be diagnosed with it. They don't know they have it. That gets very complicated. Comes from ignorance, but it's also really destructive.
You mentioned the media. If I happened to be in the States and I turned on CNN or Fox, covering the left and right political spectrums right there, I'm going to get at the commercial break, I'm either going to get a commercial for some newfangled erectile dysfunction or a psychotropic for my sadness. How can the media do anything when that's who pays their bills?
You're absolutely right. We're one of the few countries who allows direct-to-consumer advertising, and that's a huge issue. There is an aspect to this that's both frightening and fascinating, which is there's something called disease awareness campaigns. GlaxoSmithKline, this was in 2001, Paxil, which is an antidepressant, but also an anti-anxiety drug. Prozac had stolen the thunder. Prozac was making millions of dollars, eventually billions, and Paxil wasn't getting any traction as an antidepressant. They had to find another diagnosis, another disorder to treat with Paxil. Once Paxil had already been approved, they found a very obscure disorder at the time called generalized anxiety disorder, which perhaps you've heard of because it's one of the most commonly diagnosed disorders now. They found this disorder, they got approval for treating it. And then what they did is they didn't advertise Paxil, they advertised the disorder. And it's both a sinister and brilliant move. What they did is essentially gave funding to patient advocacy groups to tell people that this is this lurking disorder and people don't know that they have it. They also paid experts or physicians to say the same thing. They create fake patient advocacy groups. So suddenly it's in the public discourse and in the media that people don't know that they have this. Then they've created this whole consumer base for a drug like Paxil or whatever they're looking at. You're right about advertising about the drug, but there's another insidious disease awareness campaigns, or they're also called, quote, marketing the disorder campaigns. That's also going on. Necessarily removing direct-to-consumer advertising may not solve the problem necessarily.
If the mob of people, whatever the population is, that's more apt to accept the fact that they have XYZ condition and therefore they should take XYZ drug to therefore be cured. If the mob is telling the people in the mob, hey, this is a good thing. And I saw this the other day. I saw something that said that back in the day, they were talking about schooling. And they said, well, you know, if you've got a school full of kids that are acting up and bad kids or whatever, bring a bunch of good kids in and that will bring the bad kids up. Well, the reverse happened. The good kids went down. It looks like there's a combination of things here, but you've got the population, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or off the mark here, but you got the population, whatever that population is. We've described what we think it could be primarily, but whatever that population is, they're talking amongst themselves, they're communicating, they're open to these diagnoses. And then over here on the other side, you've got this system called the psychiatric industrial system. You got this system that's just making billions upon billions. Clearly, at this stage of the game, it's not about healthcare. Again, we have to keep doing these qualifications. Okay, on the edge of the bell curve, yes, we're going to have some people that are in dire need and they need something. However, 50% of the country being diagnosed with an issue, being put on medication, whoa, this is about money. That's all what this is. This is all about money.
Certainly for pharma, it is, for big pharma.
Why not for the local physician, though? What's their kickback? I mean, the local physician, they want to make money. So if they put XYZ patient on XYZ drug, well, they got to come back. And I don't know, is there some kind of kickback with the pharmacy? I don't know how that works. There's motivations for money all around here, aren't there?
Well, there is. One thing you just made me think of is just that The DSM is written by members of the American Psychiatric Association primarily. In the last edition, the fifth edition, 70% of those authors received research funding from big pharma. And I was interviewed on NPR, and the woman was a great interviewer. And she asked Paul Applebaum, who's chair of the DSM steering committee, why don't you just make it so that no one with ties to pharma can have anything to do with the DSM? And he essentially said, well, then we wouldn't have anyone. A very sharp answer.
But then we're also back to the beginning of our conversation about the DSM not being scientifically valid. And so ultimately, it's a subjective tool to give people diagnoses and then make money. I mean, I'm back to the college square. Prove me wrong.
I have a psychiatrist now who I believe both wants to make money and genuinely wants to help people.
Well, hold on, back to the bell curve. Back to the bell curve. Yes, on the edges, I'm sure there's going to be some really great people out there, but 50% of the country being diagnosed, all these billions upon billions, at some point we've got to say, we can't just go find the one person and say the one person's a good person, and then that just makes the conversation where I'm driving at go away, can we?
What's missing in this conversation is, I think, a more detrimental aspect of this. You're talking about greed, but what about hubris? I think that that is actually what's driving a lot of this. You've got researchers who are staking their careers on this diagnosis being this, or this, we're going to prove that this is a brain disorder. This diagnosis, which has been essentially invented or constructed, how could we ever prove it's a brain disorder? It's invented. So it's impossible. And then you've got psychiatrists in their individual practices. I went to see a bipolar expert, quote unquote. He was so determined that I stick with the bipolar disorder. That was his field. There was a lot of hubris there. Humility might also help the...
How about some science?
I agree.
I mean, how about some science? Here's what I want to drive you, though. When you bring up hubris, in some ways, and tell me if I'm pushing wrong, but when you say hubris, in a sense, it feels like you're giving that individual caregiver an out. Maybe they've got good intentions. Some doctors, they're gods. You can't question a god, so to speak. They've gone through medical school. They're the gods. Right now, we're finding out they're subjective, non-scientific gods when it comes to mental health care. But couldn't somebody also say, well, okay, yes, we could infer and maybe think that hubris is an issue, but the facts seem to say money's the issue. Regardless of how nice they might be, how well-intentioned they might appear to be, the only concrete thing we have is how much money is being made. Is that fair?
I haven't had a psychiatrist I would call nice. I'm not sure I would use that word.
I haven't had one. Maybe they're going to come and get me soon. I don't know. I might be canceled soon because of this conversation.
I'm kind of extrapolating from both my experience and also what I've read. For instance, if you read Jeffrey Lieberman's book, which really defends psychiatry, it's frightening. He basically, in some ways, denies what we're talking about. Also, essentially says that psychiatry is just on the verge of its biggest discoveries. And they've been saying this for 4 decades. One thing that goes with what we're talking about is that the National Institute for Mental Health, when the DSM-5 came out, they pulled not all funding, but quite a bit of funding from any research that was being done using DSM diagnoses. Finally saw that we're never going to find the biological cause of a diagnosis that's hypothetical. There are people now and researchers now who are looking at, for instance, psychosis instead of schizophrenia. And that is an interesting idea. I know that you're into brain science as well, and I am too, and I would love to see that happen. And I can see how looking at psychosis might have produced more science than looking at schizophrenia, which is essentially hypothetical.
You've got a quote here that I like. I think it's Alan Francis, one-time chair of the DSM task force, quoted as saying that the DSM diagnoses confuse, quote, mental disorder with the everyday sadness, anxiety, grief, disappointments, and stress responses that are an inescapable part of the human condition, end quote. There are some people that are clearly very honest I'm not breaking new ground with my skepticism here. There's clearly some very astute, studied individuals in the field that know this is a big problem.
I mean, he helped write the DSM. Robert Spitzer, who's really just a major figure in psychiatry before he passed away, also was extremely critical. And then there's also Thomas Insel, who is head of the NIMH and just devoted $20 billion, not just, but he devoted $20 billion to research into the biological causes of DSM diagnoses. And he's one of the people who finally said, look, DSM diagnoses have, and I'm quoting him, 0% validity. Stephen Hyman, another head of the NIMH, called them fictive diagnostic categories. And that's another quote. There are people who are working against this and really pivotal figures in psychiatry. Thomas Insel just came out with a book, a really wonderful book called Healing: Our Path from Mental Illness to Mental Health, in which he does give a mea culpa. He says, I'm sorry, I gave all this money to research for the biological causes of mental illness, or I should say DSM disorders, because that was the focus at the time, instead of giving money to recovery and treatment programs, which would help us deal with the human condition. And that's something I've had to do. I don't have a diagnosis anymore in the sense that I don't know what it is. My psychiatrist knows what it is. I've told him not to tell me because I don't want to identify with it. And what that's forced me to do is not just deal with, but process my emotions, look at my thoughts.
There were parts of me that did not want to read every aspect of your book for that very reason. I did not necessarily want to know all of the details. Because then I start to think, well, yes, it can help me in a way where, okay, I can learn from it. But then there's the side of me, just the way that you described that, not wanting to know.
I'm not sure I totally understand in the sense that the book is really there to make people aware of how flawed these diagnoses are.
Yeah, I get that. And that's great. I highly recommend it for everyone to take a look at for this very reason. Obviously, it's got me all geared up. Maybe this is beyond your work. This is just a larger issue at hand here. I guess I'm kind of just postulating something where it's like, I think society would be a lot better if we just dialed all this back.
I agree.
I don't see how this flawed document hundreds and hundreds of different mental disorders that are subjective, some of them made up out of whole cloth by perhaps people that are very learned. At the end of the day, I'm looking at what you describe, the information you bring forward, and it has me, I'm already into the conspiracy theory territory in my mind.
Well, what if we could get everyone one piece of information, just this one fact? Major depressive disorder is one of the most common diagnoses. It's an extremely easy diagnosis to get in the sense that you only have to exhibit the symptoms for 2 weeks. Let's just process that for a second. Just 2 weeks. That's a very short amount of time.
That's like COVID or something. You got COVID for 2 weeks. I mean, it's crazy.
When asked, so the person, Robert Spitzer again, who essentially invented the diagnosis, he was asked, why do you need 5 of 9 symptoms? And he said, it was just arbitrary. We went around the table and 4 seemed like too few and 6 seemed like too many. That's the same diagnosis we have.
If I stopped my life right now and I went down the rabbit hole, I mean, am I going to truly find out that the foundation is as flimsy as you're laying out? I mean, are there people out there that are going to say, no, Sarah's out on a limb? I mean, look, being published by HarperCollins, okay? HarperCollins is no slouch, I know. Are there going to be people, and you've got this thing, you've got Pathological, the book, your book, you've got it. Are there going to be people out there that take you to task?
I will say that's why I put in over 500 citations. I didn't want anyone to think this was just coming from me, that this is really factual and coming from peer-reviewed journals and that sort of thing. One thing I've been surprised by is I expected all this pushback from psychiatry, and I really haven't gotten it yet, I should say.
They hope you go away. That's how it works.
Tom Insel has really embraced the book and really supported the book. As I said, I was on NPR with Paul Applebaum, and he really didn't push back. You'd be hard-pressed to find, I don't know this, there's no data on this, but a psychiatrist who doesn't know what's going on and all the controversies around the DSM. Although I do think you probably could find someone. But the two sort of defenses are both frightening. So one says, and this is something that Paul Applebaum alluded to, is that, look, we've got very good psychiatrists. They are good at what they do, and they can use the DSM for what it's worth and get people the care they need.
But that sentence didn't mean anything. If I tried to quantify what you just said, there's no way I can quantify it. It's entirely subjective.
Not only that, but primary care physicians are doing most of the diagnosing. We can throw that away. The other defense, which is even more frightening, is I don't use the DSM. That's the defense, which means the diagnosis you're getting is literally the opinion of one person based on nothing.
Jesus. I mean, I've been doing this podcast for a long time. I should know some of the things that you're talking about, but I have to admit that I did not understand the gravitas of this. I did not realize how subjective it was. This, I mean, somebody could say, well, Mike, and maybe you would say the same thing. Somebody might say, Mike, you're making a jump. This sure looks like this is a foundational element to American conflict.
I agree. I would not say that's saying too much. What baffles me is why this isn't in the media, why this isn't in public discourse. I was in the mental health system for 30 years and I didn't know this. So for you not to know it, I mean, I could understand.
Money. I mean, why did Harper even let you publish a book? I don't know. I mean, give them credit because, I mean, look, there is a lot of money. I mean, do you know the gross sales figures for psychotropic drugs? I don't know. It's got to be multi-billions. How big is it? Do you know?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that Eli Lilly, before the patent went out, I don't know exactly, but it was in the billions. I think they were at 3 billion and then 10 billion. The other part about this is that the American Psychiatric Association, the DSM is their bread and butter. Everyone has to buy it. It costs $200. No book should cost $200. It's a book. Psychiatrists have to buy it, and hospitals and training facilities and medical schools.
I want to see a copy of this thing. I'll go spend the $200 because I mean, maybe I'll start doing every episode, I'll have a DSM entry that I'll read out.
The APA made $20 million off the DSM-5 in the first year.
But that's small potatoes compared to the big enchilada. I mean, they use all the academics and they use all the very smart people to this cover. The pharma industry has created this world, this interesting world. I would assume that people are being targeted. If 50% of the country is being diagnosed like this, they are being targeted, and they are being targeted for money. They're being targeted to be gacked up on this crap. Then they're stuck in the system, so to speak.
Well, I have to say, pill shaming to me is not productive. It's not a constructive way to go. The reality is we don't know how psychotropic drugs work.
That's enough for me to shame them.
You don't have to shame them.
I want to do more than shame, okay? If they don't even know how the damn things work, I want to do more than shame. I want to fight. You're like, oh my gosh, I wanted to talk to Michael, but now I don't know.
No, there are so many people who agree with you, and I absolutely understand that perspective. The problem is they've helped me, and what happens often, especially with antidepressants, if you've taken them for a long time, your body becomes dependent on it.
That's not good either.
No, it's absolutely not. That's why I mentioned the exit strategy. That's why people need to know, okay, how am I going to phase out of these? Right now, I'm on medication, and I don't know if that's benefiting me or if my body's simply dependent on them.
What's interesting about you is you are laying all of this information out. It's like you're standing on the edge of the cliff. For your first couple pages, you lay the industry bare. You're not pulling any punches. But when I push you a little, there's a little bit of hedging. Like you don't want to jump off the cliff and kind of go as hardcore as me.
No, because there are plenty of people doing that. And I don't think it's helpful because I've been in the mental health system and I've been very, very ill and I've needed help. There are a lot of people who need help. Just suddenly just discount everything would be denying people perhaps some relief. And if we can get people some relief, I don't know what it's like in Saigon, but when I walk down the street and I see someone who's clearly homeless, suffering from psychosis, what are we going to do with that person? So if someone wants to burn down the whole establishment, I want that person to have a solution first.
You make an interesting case, and I'm going to address what you brought up about other countries. I think it's an important point. All we can see in America right now is these folks that clearly are out on a limb they've set up tent cities in inner city America everywhere. And this is not going to get better. You say, well, Mike, I'm just being rhetorical here. You say, Mike, well, before you kill the system, we need something better. And I'd say, well, could anything be worse than what we got right now?
Possibly. It could. Are you willing to risk that? Are you willing to be responsible for those people's lives?
To me, when I look at what the DSM is, the validity of it, the reliability of it, the way you describe it, the way that you source your perspectives, assuming you are all correct here, and I think you are, yeah, I'm ready to throw it out the window. Let me bring something up and I'll let you give some feedback on this. I actually was having a conversation with a Vietnamese female friend today about the fact that I was going to speak with you, and I had shared just some basic information. She shared that she had a friend who was talking with a psychologist in Saigon and talked about some medication and whatnot. That's really rare. I can share that in this particular country, it's very rare. So where does that leave any particular country that is not the same as America when it comes to mental health care? What percentage of the overall population is falling through the cracks because they don't have the health care they need, the mental health care they need, versus in America where we're clearly overdiagnosing and creating an industry out of thin air? That's the real rub, is what percentage of people truly need help versus what percentage of people have just been lured into the system.
Well, now you're defending the DSM, because that is actually the rationale that the architects of the DSM use, which is, and this is again a quote from Robert Spitzer, they want to cast a very wide net. That's their philosophy. That's their logic. That's how they've come up with 541 different diagnostic categories.
But hold on, isn't that a scam? You said 541. Isn't that a scam?
Well, is it a scam or is it doing what you just said, which is we're trying to diagnose as many people as possible. So we have to create these diagnostic categories to be sure.
I was just saying that there's going to be people that if you don't have, for example, if you don't have the same type of mental health care system and big pharma psychotropic drug system where I'm at now versus America, okay, then some people where I'm at now are going to fall through the cracks. In America, it's clearly just a business. I'm not saying the DSM necessarily solves anything there. If we don't have the American system, then some people are going to go without the care they need.
I'm not sure we need 541 diagnostic categories. The first edition of the DSM had 128. Let's just look at the numbers.
So a lot of really smart PhDs in the field have literally made 400 of these things up to get prescriptions filled.
I think in their minds, it's to, again, make sure no one falls through the cracks.
Well, then I'd have to see the size of their house, what kind of car they're driving too.
I don't know.
Well, this is where I was driving at with you, though, is that you seem to be making the case where, look, you've got me all riled up. You stop at a line where you're not willing to say things as hardcore as I'm saying.
Well, I don't think you're speaking from experience, for one thing. And I know what it's like to be in crisis, and I know what it's like to need care. That's why my book, in some ways, is different in that we can critique the system, absolutely. And a lot of the critique comes from people from inside the system. So there are plenty of people who share your views that have been through what I've been through and far worse. That is where my hesitation comes from, because I don't want to deny anyone any help that they can get. And that's just where I draw the line.
But people are clearly being lured into this system that don't deserve to be there by the same potential healthcare providers that might be doing some good are clearly not doing good for a lot of people. I don't think I have to have necessarily any experience in the system to say that, because you've given me this fine piece of work that kind of maps it out for me. Thank you for that blueprint, by the way.
Yes. Another quote from Alan Francis. He's a remarkable man in this respect, but he has a really poignant quote where he says that the cruel irony of psychiatry is that the people who are most in need of care aren't getting it, and those the least in need of care are getting it to their detriment. That just sums it up so perfectly.
Before I let you run, I'll share one thing with you. In my regular world, I write these investment books. The investment strategy that I write about is all kind of something that you can look at through the scientific method. There's no opinion. There's no, I think this is going to happen tomorrow. It's like, what does the data tell me right now? And I'm going to use this exact data and a very objective, I will buy on this day or sell on this day, objective rules that you can codify into a computer and follow them. Now, other people might have some strategy, fair enough, whatever, but it's a very objective scientific base. You're getting a lot of that from me today, where it's like, you kind of like walk into my world you're spelling this out, and it's just shocking. It's shocking.
It is. You can't imagine what it did to me. I was in the system when I learned this. I was part of it.
You make that case in your book, and people are going to have to check that out. You get into a lot more detail. You really lay out what happened to you. I mean, the nitty gritty, you're a hell of a writer. I think people really were going to have to jump in. I wanted to stay where I was coming at today on this conversation. You do a great job. Hopefully I've inspired you on book number 2. You're going to like walk in with a chainsaw, and it's like, you're going to just like, oh my gosh, I talked to crazy Michael over there in Southeast Asia. And now I got the chainsaw out, and now I'm going for the entire industry, for the juggler.
I'm actually already writing it. It's the sequel to Pathological, and it is attacking essentially, well, not essentially, but it's attacking more pointedly this idea and how it got perpetuated that mental illness is chronic, because I believe I haven't just recovered. I'm not in remission. I'm cured. It won't come back. No one will tell you that. Mental Health America, National Alliance for Mental Illness, on their website, it says that you will have these disorders for the rest of your life. That's what I'm going after next.
I'll leave this as a final question. Is there some side of you that occasionally ponders the idea that maybe before all of these diagnoses happen, these 6, all this time and money and energy and everything that you've spent, a lot of trouble, turmoil. I mean, I just can't imagine having to go through all that. But is there a side of you that sometimes occasionally ponders maybe there was nothing wrong with you?
I've never pondered that. No.
Is it possible, given the overall broad context of this conversation, the whole idea of the DSM, we've got people that have written the thing basically saying they've made up things out of whole cloth. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm just as a theoretical conversation. Is it possible?
I see where you're coming from 100%. Because I'm now well, I know what it was like before to live in my mind. I know what it was like. And there was something wrong. There was no question. I have a different mind now.
Is there the chance, though, also, I asked the poignant question of how many different psychotropic drugs are you on? And okay, memory, you say, well, I'm not really sure exactly. And then we know these drugs do things to the mind. Is there also the chance that you could have been, as you map out in the work, map out in Pathological, you could have had a short-term issue, then you're on drugs, then there's a brain chemistry change. Is that also possible?
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with the latter point more.
This is the scientific method, isn't it, right? To dig in and kind of look at all the potential possibilities?
100%. I don't like pill shaming because we don't know how they work. They can work for some people. And I don't know. Maybe that is what helped. But for me, diagnosis did not help. Identifying with a diagnosis did not.
Fascinating conversation. I could probably bounce around forever. How do you feel about my questioning, by the way? This is a sensitive subject. I don't know if I'm considered too rough and ready, or how do you feel about my questioning?
No, I love it. I absolutely want pushback. I'm really confident in the book. And I also know that I've done my research and I know what's there and what's not. So yeah, absolutely. Bring it.
Sarah, cool stuff. The book, Pathological, the true story of 6 misdiagnoses. People are going to have to dive in. Is there a place where you'd like to send people? We can direct them to Amazon, all the booksellers to buy the book. Is there a website you might want to send people to?
You can buy it on Amazon, or if you prefer to support your local bookstore, you can buy it on IndieBound. I'm at sarahfay.org.
Cool. Sarah, keep me posted on future works. Fun conversation.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.